When you internalize someone else's read of you, you stop living and start performing. You anticipate the judgment and then become it. You adjust your behaviour to fit a story that was never even accurate in the first place. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be. And I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share in this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations. So please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. So, this one's been sitting with me for a while. It's something I've been thinking about for a long time, and I wanted to make sure I'd got all my thoughts in order before I recorded because it feels really important to me to get it right. And I'll probably come back to this topic in later episodes too, because there's so much more to say than I can do justice to in one sitting. But this is just where I want to start. And the topic is perception. Specifically, the problem with being perceived. And I want to start with something that I think is really interesting. I think that we are constantly seeking perceptions of ourselves. And we look for it everywhere, through astrology, through personality tests, through medical frameworks, through aesthetics and tropes and identity labels, and even through those TikTok and Instagram filters where it says something like, oh, these are your 3 green flags, or let the algorithm pick a song for you. And even now, there are prompts where people ask AI to generate an image of how it sees them. And I think that they're all essentially the same thing, just frameworks that help us understand who we are and how we might be seen by others. And I think the reason we do it is because even when we feel like we know ourselves, we don't always fully admit to all of the layers, because we're curious and we want to be understood and we want to be seen as and accepted as we are. And when someone does see us, really truly see us in a specific and accurate way that we feel resonates with how we want to be seen, it can stick with us for years. You know, a niche compliment, a small observation, something someone said that just really struck you in exactly the right way. Sometimes people say things to you that you remember a decade later because it just meant that much. But I think that the opposite is also true. When someone says something that contradicts how you see yourself or how you want to be seen, and that can stick just as long, if not even longer sometimes. And that's what this episode is really about. Because this crystallized for me when I was studying abroad in Australia. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I was there from July 2019 to March 2020. I was meant to be there for a full year as part of my degree, but it got cut short because of the pandemic. And looking back, I can see that I was definitely going through a quiet identity crisis, even though I didn't really recognize it at the time. And funnily enough, one of our professors who hosted a talk on the year abroad and things that you need to know also warned us that something like this might happen. And I remember my best friend and I joking about it, because we studied English literature with creative writing, and a lot of our degree was already about identity and culture and selfhood and all of those quite existential themes, and we often wrote essays about them. So we laughed it off and said, oh, it'll be nothing new. But in hindsight, I really was going through more of an identity crisis than I even realised. I was suddenly surrounded by new people, new cultures, new nationalities, people from all over the world, and I put this unspoken pressure on myself to make an impression. Not just to be remembered, but to be remembered in a specific way. But I hadn't told anyone that. It was just something I decided internally. And I was already carrying a lot of regret before the thing I'm about to describe even happened, because I felt like I hadn't explored enough, hadn't taken enough advantage of being in Australia. And I was also carrying this pressure I'd put on myself to be remembered and to be recognisable and memorable. So I already was in a vulnerable place when one day my best friend and I were making plans to travel somewhere on our way home for Christmas. And there was something in our plan that I just didn't want to do. And one of the people we'd made friends with was sitting with us whilst we were planning, and they made a throwaway comment. It was just offhand, it wasn't malicious, and it wasn't meant to hit me in any way or anywhere in particular. All they said was, oh, don't be boring. And that was it. That was the whole comment. All because I said I don't want to do that. But it went on a loop in my head. It was all I thought about, I'm pretty sure, for days. And actually longer than that. And instead of brushing it off or pushing back, I absorbed it. And I added it into the puzzle of myself and thought, okay, so that's how I'm being perceived. And so something shifted. I started doubling down on saying no to things quite firmly and definitively. Even when secretly, I just wanted someone to gently encourage me. But I never said that to anyone. So how would they have known that that's what I wanted or needed at the time? So yeah, instead of addressing the comment, I internalized it. And over time, it slowly became a personality trait. And I started living as someone who could be perceived as boring. But here's the thing, the behaviours themselves weren't boring. They were just preferences. But in my head, I started building a narrative around them, a justification. Things like, oh, why go to the cinema when I can watch a film at home? Why go out when I have everything I need here? They're logical thoughts on the surface, but underneath, they were reinforcing a story I hadn't actually consciously chosen. And eventually, I actually started to say it out loud. Oh, I'm so boring. Oh no, I wouldn't do that. Oh no, I don't go out. I'm so boring. And when you repeat something enough, you start to believe it. I heard that comment in 2019, and it wasn't until the end of 2024 that I snapped out of it. And it honestly blows my mind that one comment shaped my habits and self-perception for years after it was said. And it's a comment that that person probably doesn't even remember making. And it really truly felt like I was living in a version of myself that didn't quite fit. And I want to give some context as to why it hit so hard, because it didn't land on neutral ground. Growing up, I've said this before, I was quite academic, but I was also labelled as the nerdy one. And during my formative years as a child, I was repeatedly called weird, fat, and ugly. And those words really stuck. And at the same time, we were consuming media that told us very specific things about what it meant to be likeable and popular and desirable. And those ideas got embedded in my sense of self before I even had the language to question them. So by the time someone called me boring in Australia, there was already quite a toxic foundation there. Years of conditioning that made it much easier for that one throwaway comment to take root. And I started meeting new people and assuming that they already saw me the way others had. Boring or weird or nerdy or unattractive, even though they had no context, no history, and no reason to think those things. I was projecting a perception onto situations where it didn't even exist yet. And I was practicing confirmation bias without even realising it. I was looking for evidence that the story was true, linking neutral choices to a narrative I hadn't meant to adopt. I'd see people doing simple things, going for coffee, going on a trip, and feel this really intense FOMO, fear of missing out, and this sense of disconnection, and this thought of, oh, that could never be me. When in actual fact, that had been me years prior. As a teenager, I was always out. I was always out with family and friends. I was always doing something. And yet this comment suddenly made me believe that I wasn't that person. And I do. I love going out. I love socializing. I love having experiences. Albeit I need time to recharge afterwards. But that has never made me someone who doesn't enjoy doing all of these things. But I'd outsourced that definition of myself to someone else, and I'd let it stick. And I think this is where imposter syndrome can quietly take root as well. You start labeling your own desires as embarrassing because they don't match the persona you're performing. You become a stranger to yourself in really small, incremental ways. And this is where I think perception becomes genuinely dangerous. Not in like a super dramatic way, but in a very subtle, almost insidious way. Because when you internalize someone else's read of you, you stop living and start performing. You anticipate the judgment and then become it. You adjust your behaviour to fit a story that was never even accurate in the first place. And I think it starts to show up subtly. Things like over-explaining your choices, shrinking yourself in certain situations, performing a version of yourself you think is expected, staying inside a known perception because it feels safer than risking being misunderstood. And that's why self-awareness really sucks in this context specifically. Because the cruelty of it is that you can be incredibly self-aware. You can notice the pattern, realise what's happening, understand exactly how you got here, and still find it incredibly hard to step outside of it. Because the story has been running for so long that it starts to feel like the truth. And you're not performing anymore, you've just become it. And at some point, I even grieved the time I felt I'd lost. I tried to reconstruct a version of myself that felt more authentic. And I felt nostalgia so intensely that it became physical. And I wanted to go back to Australia and fix everything. Try and re-experience it and make up for whatever it was that I thought I'd lost. But then I eventually realised it wasn't really about Australia. It was about how I was showing up in my own life, and the only person who could change that was me. And in recent years, I want to say over the last 2 to 3, I've been deliberately reconnecting with myself, doing things that feel familiar rather than new, going back to what I actually enjoy, not what fits a story someone else has handed to me. And I genuinely feel more like myself now than I have in years. I feel way more confident, way more at home in myself. But I do want to be honest about something. There was a moment recently where I came across something of my past self on social media and immediately judged it. And then I caught myself and thought, wait, what's the point? No one else is thinking about it. They're not going to be, old age pensioners thinking about this post that I put up 60 years beforehand and judging me for it. I guarantee they won't be thinking about their own posts they put up 60 years beforehand. And we, I think, reinterpret our past selves using standards that we've developed later. And it's so not fair, because that person, your past self, was doing the best they could with what they had. Growth isn't linear. It's integrative. It's taking all the versions of yourself, even the ones that don't fit anymore, and understand that they were all part of getting here. And I think what makes this even more interesting is that it's not just something that happens on a personal level. It scales. And something I've noticed, particularly in recent months, more than before, is that a lot of public figures I follow, YouTubers, musicians, people who have built careers in front of an audience, seem to be becoming more openly aware of it. They're talking about it in a way I haven't really seen them do before, like it's a realization that's catching up with them. The strangeness of knowing that thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people have a perception of you. And it's not just individual perceptions, but there can be a collective one. This aggregate version of you that exists in the minds of a community, shaped by every video, every post, every interview, every comment section. A version of you that had very little control over building and have almost no control over changing. And I find that simultaneously fascinating and daunting in equal measure. Because at least when it's one person who has the wrong idea about you, there's a conversation you could have. There's a correction that's possible. But when it's a collective perception, when thousands of people have independently arrived at the same idea of who you are, where do you even begin with that? And I think that's why so many public figures talk about the gap between who they are and who people think they are. Not because I think they're being precious about it, but because that gap is very much real and can be disorienting. You can be completely yourself and still have a version of you exist out there that feels like a stranger. Which brings me back to something much smaller and more personal. Because you don't need millions of followers for this to feel true. One comment from one person in one moment, as I found in Australia, can be enough to make you start living inside a version of yourself that was never really yours. So I'll leave you with 2 questions this week. Just something to sit with as always if they resonate, but do share your thoughts if you want to. The first one is, where in your life are you living according to a story someone else told about you? And the second is, and what might change if you allowed yourself to exist outside of that narrative? Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode or any of the others, please do follow, subscribe, or engage however you can. It genuinely helps more people find the podcast, and it means a lot. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!